Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 41 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Seattle Kraken, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2. We are now officially at the halfway point of the NHL season, and I'd say generally the Sharks have done pretty well, certainly have outperformed expectations. I don't think many people would have pegged the Sharks for a playoff spot at this point of the year, and yet they do manage to sit in one. It is, of course, the final wildcard spot, and there are some teams behind them that have a lot of games in hand, so maybe in terms of points percentage they aren't in a playoff spot, but technically in terms of just flat out points, they currently are in a wildcard spot, which is much better, like I said, than what most people were expecting. And yet, the mood isn't particularly high here tonight for the San Jose Sharks because of a strong first half, because of the fact that they end up losing this game. And what's so interesting about this one is that, in the end, the Sharks, you could say, on paper, didn't play all that terribly. They outshot the Kraken, they outchanced the Kraken, and you could say that they deserved to get this victory, kind of like something that I had said about the Sharks' two previous losses, which were against the Rangers and the Penguins. And yet, this isn't really the case if you were someone who watched the full 60 minutes of this game, because while you walked away from games against the Rangers and the Penguins a few days ago feeling somewhat satisfied with the performance of the San Jose Sharks, thinking, oh, well, the Sharks, they didn't have much scoring, but they played pretty well against some very good Eastern Conference teams, and if they play like this moving forward, they should win more games than not. But here tonight, you do not leave with that same sense of satisfaction and are instead leaving with a sense of frustration. Because unlike in those previous two games against the Penguins and the Rangers, where the Sharks seemed to play up to their opponents, they played down to their opponents here tonight. No offense to the Seattle Kraken, but they are one of the worst teams in the entire league, a bottom three team in the entire league, only ahead of the lowly Arizona Coyotes and Montreal Canadiens. And yet the San Jose Sharks dropped this game here tonight to them when some of their competition in this playoff race that the Sharks seem to be wanting to participate in lost games, right? The Oilers lost to the Florida Panthers, the Kings lost to the Colorado Avalanche, and those are expected losses against two powerhouses in the league, and the Sharks played against the Seattle Kraken and couldn't secure the 2 points, and they were handed this game almost on a silver platter by the Seattle Kraken. The Kraken in the third period took 5 penalties. Most teams don't take 5 penalties in a singular game, and yet the Kraken got called for 5 of them in just a single period, and the Sharks could only manage one lowly power play goal and were unable to actually tie this one up. The Sharks sort of just turned their nose up at this game and said, no, you deserve the 2 points here tonight. And so, yes, if you were someone who was just purely looking at it statistically, you could say, hey, the Sharks played pretty well here tonight. But if you're someone who actually watched this game here, you're not leaving with that same sense of satisfaction. You're leaving with a massive sense of frustration that the Sharks just let 2 points get away here tonight. This was a winnable game against a not-so-great team that the Sharks just kind of played down to. Now, what were the major issues here tonight? Well, the first one is something that has plagued the Sharks continuously this season, which has been their scoring once again. And this was an issue that we saw in the previous game against the Los Angeles Kings. It was just kind of masked by the fact that Timo Meier amazingly scored 5 goals in that one. The fact is that the Sharks only right now have a single line actually doing much of anything offensively, and that, of course, is their first line. Barabanov and Hertl and Meier were once again absolutely spectacular here tonight, getting some fantastic chances for themselves, but, we're not able to convert on a ton of them, though, of course, they still had 2 goals here tonight. Well, one of them on the power play, but one of them there at the start of the game by Tomas Hertl. They just didn't necessarily have the same amount of puck luck like they had in the previous one against the Kings, and so you're hoping for a different line to maybe help out in some way offensively, and yet the Sharks did not get any of that here tonight, like they haven't really been getting for the past few games. The other issue for the Sharks here tonight was just some defensive breakdowns in their own zone. It was kind of embarrassing to watch at times some of the opportunities that the Sharks were giving to the Seattle Kraken. You take a look, the Kraken didn't really get much of anything in terms of chances this game. They had a few of them, but not a ton, but the few that they did get were just kind of boneheaded defensive zone zone coverage from the Sharks. You take a look, the only goal that was primarily on Hill was the second one by Soucy, but the first one by Soucy, the Sharks overload the right side of the ice for some reason, which leaves Soucy completely all alone to take as much time as he wants to take a shot, as well as another player all alone in front of Adin Hill, screening him perfectly so that it's essentially zero chance to make this save. On the Seattle Kraken third goal, for whatever reason, both Megna and Matt Nieto decide to head below the goal line to challenge the Kraken player with the puck, which just leaves Järnkrok all alone in front of the net to take his sweet time to score this one past Adin Hill. Then there was another goal scored in this one by Seattle. It ended up getting called off, but it's still kind of the case where Brent Burns is just sort of floating around, doesn't really pay attention to much as Ryan Donato kind of just moves behind him and scores on the rebound. Like I said, the goal was called off. It didn't count, but still. And then there was a chance in the last 3 or 4 minutes of this third period where Seattle came oh so close to making it 4-2. Luckily for the Sharks, or I guess it didn't really end up mattering anyway, but Eberle's shot deflects off of the skate of Gourde instead of going into the empty net, and it ends up being a save because the Sharks are just letting cross ice passes go through with zero cares in the world. So this was just a sloppy defensive game from the San Jose Sharks, and like I said, a game that they should have been able to get the 2 points in. Going through the goal scores quickly, Tomas Hertl gets his 21st goal of the season in the first period, which was definitely the Sharks' best period. After that first period, the Sharks were leading 1-0, and you thought this was going to be a game that they'd be able to close out, but in the second period, the wheels came off. They give up 2 goals to Soucy to make it 2-1 Seattle. In the third period, early on, it's Järnkrok to make it 3-1. The Sharks, like I said, they got 5 power plays in the third. They only scored on one of them. That was Timo Meier's 21st goal of the season, and they'd end up losing it 3-2. On to the players to talk about here at the top. Like I mentioned already, this first line was spectacular. Balcers ends up getting sidelined here for this one as Barabanov steps back into this role on the first line, and he looked absolutely fantastic early on in this game. Fell off a bit as the game went on, but definitely in the first period, he was being a real part of this line. Hertl, Meier, and Barabanov, they had some fantastic chances in this game. They probably could have had 3 or 4 goals in this one, but they only managed the single one at the very least at even strength. But when it comes to the rest of the Sharks lineup, it leaves a lot to be desired. This Dahlin, Couture, Gregor line, when they had been first put together a few games ago, Dahlin had gotten those couple of assists and things looked really good, but they haven't really looked as great as of late. Gregor seems continuously lost when he gets opportunities. Logan Couture just doesn't seem to be able to work with these two players. Couture has looked okay when he's on the power play, I guess, but when it comes at even strength, just not really much working in terms of chemistry, and Jonathan Dahlin just hasn't really been very consistent over these past, honestly, dozen or couple of dozen games that he has played since the beginning of the season, where he had started off so hot. So the second line, which is the line where you're really hoping for the Sharks to get some support to that top line, has not really been doing much of anything. When it comes to the third line, it is something I do want to mention, the Nieto, Bonino, Cogliano line, and the Sharks have been looking pretty good over these past 6 or so games. A record prior to this one of 4-1-1 in their last 6, and I had constantly been just sort of glossing over this third line of Nieto, Bonino, and Cogliano. I'd mentioned how, they would get a couple of decent offensive zone chances, but they'd be hemmed in their own zone, and then I'd kind of write that off as, they're the checking line, so they're supposed to be hemmed into their own zone. And yes, it is the case that they probably get more defensive zone starts than most of the other Sharks lines because they are supposed to be this checking line. But the main aspect of a checking line is to be that line that isn't a liability for your team. You're not necessarily supposed to be scoring goals, which this line has not been doing, but you are supposed to at the very least be keeping the goals out of your own net. But that's not something that this line has been doing either. For the past few games, this has probably been the Sharks' worst line defensively, which is just not acceptable for a line that's its primary purpose. This is exactly why these 3 players are put together on the ice. This is what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be defending well, and they haven't been doing that at all over these past few games. So it's been easy to gloss over because the Sharks have been playing well as a unit. They've been winning games. But it's finally time to call out these 3 players. There has to be some sort of improvement coming. And when it comes to the fourth line, we saw a bit of a substitution. Raska replaced Peterson. Peterson steps out of the lineup. I wouldn't be surprised to see him return to the lineup because for whatever reason, Peterson somehow seems to have something on Booner and consistently finds himself in the lineup. I already talked about that. But Raska here played pretty well tonight. I'd say he certainly filled in the role that they're expecting him to fill in. He laid a couple of big hits. I'd say about 3 massive hits here tonight. One of them was on Giordano, which prompted a response, which drew a power play for the San Jose Sharks, as well as got Giordano, who is the Seattle Kraken captain, off the ice for 5 minutes due to that 5-minute major. So Raska certainly did his part here tonight, which was nice to see. Drew some penalties as well, not only on that particular play. So I'd say he actually looked quite solid, should maintain a spot in the lineup. When it comes to the other 2 players here, VL, once again, he didn't really get to be in the spotlight in terms of enforcer because Raska existed on his line here tonight, so he really didn't do much of anything. And Weatherby, kind of in the similar boat as Peterson, somehow manages to steal a lineup spot night in and night out. It wouldn't surprise me if he manages to find himself still in the lineup in the next game. When it comes to the defensive side of things, the player I do want to talk about is Brent Burns here, because when you look on the surface at Brent Burns, you saw a lot of decent offensive zone chances. He hit a couple of posts on some Sharks power plays. He set up some nice plays. He actually had the play that led to the Timo Meier power play goal that brought the Sharks to within 1. So generally, without looking too deeply into it, Brent Burns had an okay game at the very least, a solid offensive performance. But when you actually take a closer look, you kind of pull the curtains apart, you don't really see a pretty sight. Brent Burns actually looked quite lost at times defensively in his own zone. He was giving pucks away like they were free candy on Halloween. He was just nonchalantly not really covering his man on certain defensive zone rushes, like I mentioned on the previous one when Donato scored and then got that one called off. And so while I would say as a whole, Brent Burns wasn't terrible, I guess, here tonight if you take much more of that offensive zone play. The defensive zone play for a player who plays this many minutes a night, it needs to be better than it was here. Another player who I do want to mention on the back end would actually be Ryan Merkley, as he has another very solid game. But there is one thing I do want to see from my Ryan Merkley a bit more, which is that offensive flair. This was the big thing. I remember when Ryan Merkley was called up a few games ago, I had mentioned that the dream was finally accomplished of having on the right-hand side of the defense Brent Burns, Erik Karlsson, and Ryan Merkley, because I was expecting that whenever one of these pairings, or with any pairing on the ice for the Sharks would have some offensive, minded defenseman who could drive the play forward. And Brent Burns, he can do that. We saw that here tonight, at least somewhat, even if the defensive zone play was not good. Erik Karlsson has been doing that a lot as well. But Ryan Merkley, it feels as though he's been, solid in his own zone mostly, but on the offensive side of things, he's just hasn't really put things together, which is kind of odd to see because that was his really major draw when the Sharks drafted him. You thought the issues were the attitude, you thought the issues were the defensive zone play, but you thought the offense was always going to be there. And yet, here at the NHL level, obviously this is going to be the most difficult level to play at, so I'm not expecting him to be a 50-point player right out of the gate, but it just seems as though there isn't necessarily much doing offensively for Merkley. He seems a bit meek at times when it comes to holding the puck, which is odd because it's like a mixture of confidence as well as meekness, I would say. There was this one particular play that I think actually sums it up rather well, where it may have been on the power play, where Ryan Merkley kind of goes coast to coast with the puck, carries it in himself, very nice to see, and then he brings it close to the Seattle goal line, or at least near the face-off circle, and you're thinking, okay, what is Ryan Merkley going to do with the puck right now? Is he going to make some nice pass? Is he going to set someone up perfectly? But instead he kind of sends just a weak pass that goes, not even a pass even, because there was nobody who he was aiming for. It wasn't even a shot either. It just sort of trickles along across the crease right in front of Grubauer, right to a Seattle player, and nothing comes from this particular play. So he had the confidence to carry it in, but then it seems as though something sort of rang in his head that he needs to make a smarter play. He shouldn't be giving the puck away in a situation like this, so he ends up just sort of making nothing happen. So in general, I've talked so much about this. He actually had a very solid game. I'd say he was one of the better defensemen for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, but I just want to see a bit more offensive flair. I hope that, I don't know if this is maybe the case, I hope Bob Booner lets him be a bit more loose with his play and tell him, you know what, Merkley, your spot in the lineup, at the very least at this point, is somewhat safe. Even when Middleton returns to the lineup, he'll probably replace Magna. You try and play a bit more aggressively, try and play a bit more freely, and know that your lineup spot is not going to be threatened if there is some sort of mistake that does come from it, and then maybe see what happens. I don't think that's what's going to happen with Bob Booner, but I can only really hope. And finally, a quick mention of the goaltender for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. Adin Hill ends up getting out-dueled. Like I mentioned earlier, he had no chance on the first goal. He had no chance on the third goal, but he definitely had a chance on the second one. And of course, that ends up, you could say, being the difference maker here tonight, because Grubauer only led in 2 goals and Hill led in 3. And so a semi-disappointing night, I guess you could say, for Adin Hill because of that 1 weak goal. But, I guess it sort of happens. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the Tampa Bay Lightning. So the Sharks end up losing here tonight against Seattle, a team that is a bottom 3 team in the league, and now have to go up against the previous Stanley Cup winner for 2 years in a row, one of the best team, if not the best team in the entire league. The Sharks will need a much better performance than they had here tonight if they want to get the 2 points. Class dismissed.